hard to imagine a time when police in America have been under more scrutiny than they are today. But this country has a long, fascinating, and challenging history with law enforcement, both trying to build it up and change it. To get a better sense of how we arrived at this moment, we traveled to a place at the center of police history to see what's evolved and what many believe still needs to.
There's 21,000 names that are on these walls here of people who have lost their lives, law enforcement officers who have lost their lives.
Michael Chapman has had just about every law enforcement job in the book. Local police, DEA agent, SWAT team member, Homeland Security. Now, three-term county sheriff in Virginia.
As you've seen all of these protests unfold on television, what goes through your mind?
I think it's sad. I think it's sad because I would say that what happened up in Minneapolis set us back 20 or 30 years.
We met Chapman at the National Law Enforcement Museum in Washington, D.C. Chapman was first hired as a cop in 1978, more than 350 years after the first small sheriff's office was established in America.
America's always had a very decentralized policing system, reliance on local levels.
Right.
Has that been good or bad for this country?
I think it's important that it's decentralized because really, when you look at the communities and local law enforcement, they're really a composite of that community.
Local sheriff's departments evolved from community watches and could go in dramatically different directions. Beginning in the 1700s in the province of Carolina and spreading throughout the South, slave patrols were created to prevent rebellions and enslave people from escaping. The first city police departments were formed in the mid-19th century, Boston first, then New York, in many cases to deal with public drunkenness and social disorder. But the police often became tools of corruption for local politicians.
Here are men experienced in every phase of police work.
Efforts at reform in the 20th century gave departments more autonomy, but also led to increases in tactics like stop and frisk, alienating minority communities in particular, often leading to violent confrontations, the results of which we still see today.
Law enforcement has changed dramatically in the last 200 years.
Scott Habes is the chief curator at the National Law Enforcement Museum, which has everything from Bonnie and Clyde's Tommy gun to the original RoboCop costume used in the 1987 film.
Drop the gun, you are under arrest.
About a future dominated by machine instead of man.
Your move, creep.
RoboCop is interesting because, again, it allows people to think about policing in terms of advancements in technology and what that means for the future.
Technology advancing, but there also still has to be a humanity to it.
Right, which I think is apropos, too, in terms of this. Policing still involves human beings and relationships, and I think that will never change.
Habes showed us some other items as well, including a noisemaker used by the earliest police forces to summon help, the hat worn by Osama bin Laden when he was killed, and
what is this? This looks like a lightsaber.
It does. It's actually from the 1920s originally, and what it is a combination baton and tear gas thrower. And it was actually used straight through the 1960s in the protests, the famous protests of the 60s.
This museum has examples of the good and the bad.
Yes, it does. And I think that's an ongoing conversation that we're trying to update as we speak. You know, part of our mandate is to envision the future of law enforcement and to also improve the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve.
As it stands today, there are more than 18,000 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in the U.S. That includes more than 750,000 sworn officers, who Chapman says are supposed to protect all 330 million Americans, regardless of place or time.
You know, a few weeks ago, before Minneapolis, the law enforcement's dealing with COVID-19 and first responders dealing with COVID-19. People are coming by, they're bringing us donuts, they're bringing us sandwiches, they're bringing everything. We were heroes, okay? A couple weeks later, we're villains. I mean, so I think the public tends to go up and down on things, but we need to make sure that people understand that we try to do our job professionally, correctly, we take it very seriously, and we really do want to serve the citizens to the best of our ability.
When you hear the slogan, defund police, what do you think?
I just think it makes no sense at all. We have to make sure that there is some protection for the safety of our citizens, and law enforcement historically has been the best way to do that.
There are some who make the argument that it's not defunding the police, we just want to reallocate resources. What do you think of that?
If you look at what's happened over time, actually law enforcement has become like the mental health professionals, and our jails have become the mental health facilities. And it's largely because we're available, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You're going to have mistakes, but for the most part, we do pretty well.
What change do you think needs to happen?
I think we need to continue to work in the direction that we have been, de-escalation techniques, making sure that we're working with our community, really getting to understand what they're about, seeing what church groups you have, what different community groups you have. We have multicultural groups that we're part of, so we're really engaged with the community, and I think that goes a long way.
That community policing he talked about, Michelle, as you know, really began to rise in the 80s, and it's a trend that continues to this day. And I think when Chapman talks about the mental health part about it, it's pretty fascinating to think about what police are doing now and what they may have done 40 or 50 years ago if they saw someone on the street who's in crisis and there's a problem. 40 or 50 years ago, maybe thrown in handcuffs, arrested. Today, most try to take a different approach. Doesn't always work, but that's the approach.
So much to say about this, and it's a long discussion that we must continue. Thank you, Jeff. Important, insightful.